The night had laid itself over the city like a bruised velvet curtain, softening hard edges and turning traffic lights into smeared jewels upon the wet pavement, and in the quiet wedge of storefronts along Cardigan Street, where the wind threaded itself through old metal gratings and whispered down the alleyways as though paging through a book of secrets, the Lark and Lantern Café stood alone with its chalkboard still smudged from the day and its front window reflecting a lone woman with a key between her fingers, the final ritual of lock and turn that meant the world would stop asking her for anything until morning. Mara Santos paused with her hand at the deadbolt as the espresso machine gave its last sigh, steam ghosting upward to dissolve against the strings of warm Edison bulbs, and in that candlelit hush of a closing shop she took a breath that tasted of caramelized sugar and roast, of lemon zest so fine it had become part of the room's air, then slid the bolt home with the little clink that was always prayer and punctuation, small but profound, and lifted her eyes to see him standing outside in the rain, a figure materializing out of midnight like a sentence she never thought she'd read again, a silhouette in a drenched wool coat under the awning's dripping edge, hair plastered, jaw set, the kind of silhouette the papers would have made into a headline even if he were sleeping, and her stomach responded with a flinch that was muscle memory and old blood. Julian Hale, the man the business magazines called a visionary and the women's magazines called impossible, the man who had once pressed his palm to the back of her neck and promised not forever, because he refused to lie, but something almost as audacious tomorrow. He lifted a hand not to touch the door but simply to show he could, and through the glass his voice skated over the low hum of the city like a stone across water, breaking the mirror of stillness with a request that was at once too small and too heavy to carry. Mara, 5 minutes. I'm asking for one last chance. For a heartbeat she just listened to her own pulse, to the way it hammered at her like a door, and then something in her, maybe habit, maybe the refusal to be cruel, made her flick the lock back open in a solitary click and pull the door inward enough to let his breath spill into the threshold with the damp and cold and penny taste of rain. You can have 3, she said, though her voice wavered on the syllables like a tightrope walker feeling the wire hum, and he nodded with that care he had when he was trying to be smaller than he was, trying to fold himself into a body that the world hadn't stretched into legend, and stepped into the amber spill of her little world with a shiver he couldn't quite mask, the expensive coat dark with weather and his suit beneath untidy at the cuff, tie loosened to the second button in a way she had seen once at 2 in the morning when numbers were failing him and he'd thrown his tie toward her like a lifeline and she'd laughed. The door swung shut. Once he was inside, the outside caught and cancelled, leaving them in the suspended hush of a stage before the orchestra returns, and for a moment neither of them spoke, only watched the rain tick against the window and pattern itself into lines like handwriting. The cafe, with its mismatched chairs and scuffed checkerboard tile, its jars of cinnamon sticks and its bouquet of wooden stirrers, its bar of 12 stools each named by their squeak, seemed to lean forward too, as though the room itself remembered him, remembered how he used to stand in that same place when the world was only 7 blocks wide and their ambition could be contained in a single table with a sugar caddy and a notebook, and he would draw boxes and arrows and the word upcoming in a rectangle and ask her if that was the right word, as though she had ever heard him pick the wrong one. You're wet, she said, because it was the smallest truth available and because the bigger ones were like doors to rooms she had promised herself she would never re-enter, and this place is closed, and he nodded with a tired smile that didn't reach anywhere. I know, but you're a soft touch for strays, he said, gesturing toward the cat asleep on the pastry case fig. Tuxedo-coated tyrant and part-time therapist who opened one yellow eye and then judged them both unworthy of further attention, and for lost causes, he added, and that's when she recognized the particular ragged edge in his voice not heard in the boardrooms or on panels or in the pages of Fortune, an edge that might have been cut by grief, or by the realization that there were rooms his money couldn't open, and she pressed her lips together against the pressure behind them and turned toward the counter as though that movement was a shield. "Do you want coffee?" she asked, "or are you here to tell me something I don't want to hear?" And he said her name in that careful way he had, the way he used to say it at 1 a.m. when she was dead on her feet and he'd bring her the last lemon tart the baker's left. "I'm here to ask if you'll let me fix one thing, just one," and the unscarred part of her that still believed in difference threw sparks in her ribcage, while the scarred part, the part that remembered the morning after that article in Gloss that announced his engagement to a woman with lineage and cheekbones, as if love could be a chess move, folded her hands tightly so she could feel the bones press. "Make your request," she told him, "and then get out." The kettle roared like a small storm as if trying to answer him first, reflexively obedient to her turning the knob, and as she tamped the espresso and felt the familiar heft of the portafilter, the second-by-second arrangement of attention that made movement into relief, she knew he was watching her with the hunger of someone who had been starving for something nobody at his level had the ability to serve, the ordinary, the way people say goodnight to their places like pets, the way a tiny universe closes its eyes. She didn't offer him a seat. Somehow the height difference between standing and sitting felt like a concession she could not afford, so he stayed where he was near the door, dripping onto the mat and clearing his throat more than once as though truly unsure of where to begin in a story that had too many false starts. And when she slid a mug across the counter toward him, the weighty white ceramic with its one hairline crack that always looked like a coastline, he took it into those hands that had signed papers worth entire skylines and lifted it toward his face like a pilgrim, eyes closing for a breath as the steam lifted, and she was forced to remember not just the headline of him, not just the clean lines of his suits and the quiet of his drivers and the way rooms rearranged themselves to include him, but the sweat-smudged nights too, the nights in this very place when, as the hour grew late, he'd roll up his sleeves and insist they make the last batch of almond croissants together, clumsy but earnest, laughing when he dusted half the floor with powdered sugar, speaking not in numbers then but in the soft questions of a man who wanted some place to lay his mind down and let it be quiet. What are we, where are we going, how do we make something that lasts? He had held her face like a compass and said he didn't know how to be good at one life while he was building another, and she had thought that was an explanation until it turned out to be an exit sign, glowing. "There's a sale," he said now, voice going deliberate, each word like a stepping stone he was refusing to miss, "of this block, of this building, of your lease folded in with 9 others, and the board will sign the terms at 9 in the morning, which means the developer's right of first refusal triggers at midnight, and it lifts your protections, Mara, for new construction. You'll get a check that's not enough and a goodbye," and her stomach went cold with a light. Alternately like anger and like recognition. "We've heard rumors," she said, "because the city told on itself if you listened, because her friend Omar from the night shift had showed her the man in the cheap suit measuring the sidewalk 2 afternoons ago, taking notes not about people walking by but about the angle of a shadow like he was planning to catch it. I called your office," she added, in a tone that tasted like pennies, 2 weeks ago, when the notice came slipping under the door like a hotel voucher for a place you never wanted to go, and your assistant said you were in Geneva, and then she said Singapore, and then she said somewhere that sounded like a story, and then she stopped saying anything, and he flinched like a paper cut, small and deep. "Yes," he said, and took another sip, "because I've been making a mess that might be cleanable, because I bought a piece of the block out from the developer in the last 12 hours and parked it in a trust that I intend to make irrevocable before dawn, a trust that's meant to keep places like this safe from people like me, except the trust needs an anchor tenant to justify the carve-out and activate the terms under the city's community preservation clause, and I need that tenant to be you, and I need you to sign something tonight," and the room pressed closer in around them, the lighting slipping into something that made his face look both older and more transparent. An anchor, she repeated, tasting the word the way one tests a foreign coin. You need me to save your plan so you can save me, is that it? And he looked at her with something like humility and something like regret. No, he said, I need you to save yourself and this block and the old woman at the bodega who hasn't missed a day in 26 years, and I need to stop being the man who can only say sorry as a postscript. And the breath she took burned. Your engagement, she said, because the old splinter shone in the light and demanded. Pulling, was a deal point, he said, too fast, like someone who had practiced answers in an empty room and found them weakening. One I regret, one I called off a month later, and she heard the papers rustle of that month, the way the world had redrawn itself without her. You didn't call it off for me, she said, and he shook his head once. I called it off because it was the wrong life and I couldn't attach my name to a lie anymore, but I should have called you the next minute and didn't. Because I was ashamed, and the word was a rarely admitted currency in his mouth, old and strange, and very nearly persuasive. The rain knocked at the window like the knuckles of a too persistent messenger, and if this were a movie, she thought, this would be the part where the soundtrack laid in a violin under the sound of the steam wand, where the camera would circle them while the city throbbed in the background and the memory shots would intercut with now his profile at the window that first time, the night he walked out, the morning she baked 5 dozen dulce de leche crullers while crying so quietly that Omar put on Thelonious Monk just to give her noise to disappear into. But this wasn't a movie, and she wasn't a girl who could count on the script to arc toward her, and every promise he made came wrapped in the kind of paper she had learned to distrust, paper that was too crisp, signatures too beautiful to be honest. He set his cup down and, with the small ceremony of a man trying to show his insides, extracted a document case from the inner pocket of his coat, the leather softened by time, and when he laid it on the counter and opened it, the closeness between them became a kind of pressure chamber, because there, under the light that made truth feel more likely, were papers whose margins were flecked with sticky notes, hand-cut with a blue-handled scissor, his scribbles in black and then in pencil over the black when he second-guessed himself, words like irrevocable and community land trust and covenant, words he would have used to fight against her, once, were turned to face lines that might hold if she believed them. She didn't put out her hand at first, too aware of the way the page's smell of toner could become the scent of an entire year, the way a signature, once given, carried weight like a ring, like a season, and then slowly she pulled the top page toward her and scanned, reading not only for logic, which was present, but for the subtle cues of a trap, which remained invisible, and when she lifted her eyes to his face, he looked like a man caught halfway between hope and surrender, and she hated that he still had any power to make her feel protective. You're asking me to trust you, she said, on the night before you take away the neighborhood, and he shook his head with a trace of impatience that felt like a familiar itch. I'm asking you to trust the structure I am willing to fall on my sword to set in place. I'm asking you to sign so that if I fail at sunrise, this trust triggers anyway and the block has an advocate who is not me, because I don't get to keep this if you sign, it isn't mine, and she felt something within her shift against its own resistance, like a door whose paint has stuck but not irrevocably, and perhaps because she had learned to survive by interrogating everything, she said, "Why me?" and watched as he had to swallow before he could say it. Because I built my first version of courage in this room, because I have used this place as my north without sending it a postcard, and because you were the person who saw what I could be and I repaid you by choosing a room where you wouldn't be invited, and because if you sign, I have to live with the smallest truth for the rest of my life that the best thing I do will have your handwriting on it, and for one astonished second, the confession made something gleam within her that had been dulled by 1,000 small practicalities, but gleam was dangerous and generosity was a currency that drained too easily. Fig lifted his head now and yawned the yawn of a creature who has never been threatened by an eviction notice, and the moment's tension broke not into laughter but into motion, because a hand pounded on the door with the authority of a gavel, then another, the silhouette behind the glass not softened by rain, a woman in an impeccable charcoal coat under a black umbrella held by an assistant, hair glossy and expression like a blade, the silver shape of a court envelope in one hand. Both of them turned to look, and Julian breathed out a curse under his breath and said without turning back to Mara, "That's Cynthia Vale, General Counsel, and if she managed to find me, it means the others aren't far," and the knock turned into a polite tap that felt more threatening. "Julian," came the voice through glass, "honey, smooth it over steel, come out, this isn't how we behave when billions are at stake," and something in Mara leapt to attention as though a fire had gone from the stove to the drapes. She walked to the door and lifted a hand to the divide. "We're closed," she said, and Cynthia's smile flashed into view like a fast coin trick. "Of course," she said, "but your friend knows this woman can ruin his week if he doesn't make a better choice in the next 5 minutes," and Julian moved behind Mara as though to protect her from an arrow that wasn't yet launched and said, "This is why I came here, this is what I'm trying to say," and Mara felt the old fight in her, the one that made her a good business owner and a more dangerous enemy, unfurl like a flag. She reached up and slid the lock into place, meeting Cynthia's eyes through the glass, and just then, like an elevator in a quiet building that begins to rise because someone pressed a button far above, Mara felt not fear but a graduate-level version of it. It was not her fight, and yet it was the continuation of every day she had stood behind that counter and refused to be made small, and she turned to Julian. "If I sign this, you'll have to go to war with your own company to make it stick," and he nodded. No explanation, no self-congratulation, just that tired acceptance of a large pain taken on purpose, "and if I don't sign, the board proceeds, and the developer turns our block into somewhere unlived in that photograph's well," she continued, and he nodded again, a silent yes. She thought of Mrs. Klein, who came every morning at 8 with her crossword and her lipstick, of Omar's mother, who had danced with the broom the day the health inspector gave them a 100, of the 3 high school kids who sat in the corner and pretended to study while writing screenplays, of the winter nights when the heat upstairs went out and she put a kettle on each table and they held their hands above the steam, and she thought of him as he had been at 2 in the morning at this exact counter, reading aloud from an email to make sure the words didn't taste of the wrong thing, the bruise of his late nights and his early flights. Love had been the smallest part of what they had, and that was the strangest thing to admit, because it made what had happened both easier to forgive and harder to forget. The knocking stopped, the umbrella bobbed away like a spooked creature, then a different sound, something like the hollow warble of a phone set to vibrate on a countertop of glass, throbbed against the front window, the press beginning to sense the story and sniff at its edges. Julian set a hand on the counter to steady himself. "They can't stop me as long as I file by midnight," he said. "They can only make it expensive, and I can afford that," a line that would have sounded like arrogance if not for the way his fingers tightened white at the edges, and she, who seldom gambled unless the game was coffee, found herself moving not toward the door but toward her pen drawer, sliding it open to the tidy rows of Sharpies and fountain pens, to the little black roller that bled only when asked. She pulled out the pen with the chipped gold cap that used to be her father's, the one he had signed their first lease with, and set it on the paper with a hand that did not shake because it had learned itself in a kitchen, and kitchens do not allow tremors, not with knives and boiling sugar. "Tell me what I'm signing," she said, and he came around the counter then not to show her the document. She wouldn't let him get that close but to point from a respectful distance. This line acknowledges the trust's purpose to maintain tenancies for small businesses and keep them at a sustainable rent pegged to revenue. This line makes you an advisory board member with one vote equal to mine, and this one says that if I die or disappear or am otherwise legally prevented from acting, you and the other board members continue without me and cannot be overruled. And she saw it then, that he had written himself out of his favorite room in order to keep it lit, and she nodded once and touched the pen to the page and signed her name in letters that had grown from their teenage uncertainty into the unarguable script of a woman who had done repiping with her own hands and argued grease-trap standards with a man who wore a tie. The pen made a small sound like a zipper as it crossed the surface, and when she lifted it, it left her with a feeling not of release but of increasing gravity, and in that moment Cynthia's umbrella reappeared framed by two other shadows, a blur of face and a camera lens, and the first flash seared the room like lightning. Julian flinched and then did something she had almost never seen him do. He took a step back and bowed his head as though the weight was too much to carry erect, and then he straightened again as if reminded of some inner instruction and lifted his own pen, a midnight blue Mont Blanc she had once bought him after a deal had gone through that kept 100 jobs in the city, a childish hope disguised as a practical gift, and now he clicked it open with a small crack and signed under hers, his name longer, angrier, the J like a kick against the corner of something that would not move. The minute hand on the wall clock ticked to 12, and in that theater of time the choice became permanent, like a wedding or a death, and she breathed through the lightheadedness that came and reached for the little seal, the notary stamp she had gotten when she realized she might be asked to notarize neighborhood births and wishes, and pressed it into the ink pad and then onto the corner, leaving behind the embossed truth of their midnight. The door shook again, and this time it wasn't a knock so much as the rattling of someone losing patience with ritual, and the assistant's voice called through, "Mr. Hale, you're making an error that will cost shareholders," the language of a world that thought of profit as a god one could offend and appease. Julian's eyes were on Mara, not the door, and he said, "There's another thing," and she felt the small smile at the corner of her mouth that he used to call a weather vane tilt toward irritation again. "Of course there is," she said, half to herself, and he reached to his coat pocket once more and pulled out his phone with the weariness of a man reaching for water in a desert, and tapped the screen and placed it flat on the counter and pressed a button, and suddenly the room was full of another voice, shaky and brave, Zoe, his younger sister, the one who had kept her last name when he changed his, who had called Mara the night after the engagement announcement and said, "He is doing the wrong thing," in a room full of people who clap too easily, who had disappeared from the city soon after and started running a shelter upstate. "He told me he was going to do it, Zoe said into the room as though she were inside the sugar jar with them. "I told him to be brave the way you told me once, when the welfare social worker made me feel sunburned for needing help, and you said, 'Babe, leaning is not the same as falling,' and I told him to lean toward the good and it would hold," and Mara's hand went to the counter edge because remembering those words in her own voice felt like looking through an old window at her old self and wanting to call her back, to tell her more, to tell her not to make some mistakes and to make others faster. "This isn't about me asking for you to forgive him," Zoe said, "it's about him finally choosing a room that fights for something that fights back," and then the line clicked and the phone fell quiet. The clock made itself heard again, a tiny metronome, and the cafe seemed to exhale, and Mara could almost feel the city block outside shifting under their feet, aligning in response to something she couldn't quite name, a slight tilt in the moral geometry. Not that anything got easier. If this were a different genre, the board would slink off at morphine dawn and the light would do the rest, but this was the city and men like those men were accountants of injuries, and the legal emails began arriving in crisp, self-righteous bursts. They would seek injunctive relief, they would contest the trust, they would call into question his competence and her motives, they would remind him that fiduciary duty was not a phrase you could refine with coffee and a wish. Mara read a few lines and then set the phone down as though it had sprouted something unpleasant. "Do you care about what this will do to your name?" she asked Julian, and he half laughed in a way that made her chest ache. "I've cared so much about my name that I stopped recognizing myself," he said, and then added, "If I'm careful, I can use the attention if I go public first and frame it as a founder returning assets to the city. They have to explain themselves, and they stink in the light." A ruthless pragmatism that felt familiar and yet not the same as before. She moved around the counter, past him, to the front door because she could feel the crowd growing outside, self-selected by gossip, by curiosity, by the scent of blood in the street. She flipped the sign to closed again with a decisiveness that asserted a boundary without apology, then stepped back and put up the little cork sign she kept under the counter for when neighborhood kids wanted to film their weird art. "School projects no filming without consent," and met the eye of the first camera at the glass and held it long enough that the person lowered it a fraction. She wasn't a symbol and she didn't want to be anyone else's content, not tonight. "Tell me the truth," she said then, because the room had shifted and they were in a different scene now, because the forms were signed and the next step involved something larger than both of them. "The thing you haven't told me that you'll wish you had when this burns," and he sat on the third stool from the left without asking, the one that squeaked like a rusty gate, and put his elbows on his knees like a man in a pew, head bowed, and for a minute she almost felt sorry for time, for how it would have to carry this moment. "I said yes to that engagement because my father called me the morning of the board vote and told me if I didn't make the acquisition look respectable, the investors would bolt and 1,000 people would lose their jobs and he would die disappointed," he said, and Mara blinked, because she'd known his father had been fierce but not that he had been weaponized love. "And then he died anyway the next week," Julian said, driving home from work after drinking 2 glasses of something they wanted him to drink, and the funeral smelled like roses and something rotten, and I stood there and thought, if I had chosen you, he would still be dead but I could look at myself," and he inhaled, sharp, "and then I didn't call you because I couldn't bear to watch you measure me and find me smaller," and Mara closed her eyes because there are apologies and there are autopsies and this was the latter, and some strange kindness came to sit near her and put its head on her knee. "A dog that belonged to no one," the words didn't excuse, and she didn't want them to, but they placed objects on a table where before there had been only shadows, a father, a funeral, 1,000 jobs, a calculation that failed in both directions, a woman who had smoothed her hair in a mirror that morning not knowing the man she loved had already turned her into a footnote in his own story. She opened her eyes and met his, and he looked at her the way a younger man had, the night he had asked her if he could try, if he could be the kind of person whose name wasn't only a brand but a vow, and her mouth, which had been a weapon and a well so many times, said, "I'm tired, Julian," and it was everything and also a small admission, and he nodded, "So am I," and they sat there with the rain making a kind of heartbeat on the window and the clock verifying their mortality, and then she got up and did the only thing she could think of that made any sense at all. She made him eggs on toast, the way he liked, with butter that tasted of grass and a sprinkle of chives, and he ate as though eating were an act of faith and said, "You're the only person who ever fed me without presenting the check first," and she rolled her eyes and said, "Please don't say things like that, you sound like a book nobody should read," and he laughed, and the laugh landed gently, and outside someone yelled his name and then a different name louder and the sound washed past the door like a wave that did not breach, and in the kitchen the smell of warm bread was a domestic miracle, and for a sliver of time the world was only what it had been before ambition and fear multiplied. By 2 in the morning, The crowd had thinned to a strange and loyal scattering: Mrs. Klein in her bathrobe with a trench thrown over it, Omar with his skateboard like a flag, a couple of the high school kids under the awning wide-eyed and whispering as though they might be about to witness a coup, a woman from the florist's up the street holding a bouquet of 3 gerberas like a talisman, and Mara had called Marco, the freelance reporter with a conscience who had written the kindest piece about their community fridge during the blackout summer, and said, "If you're going to write about this, don't make it about his suits, make it about my lease," and he'd laughed and said, "You always write it for me, babe," and showed up 10 minutes later with a camera that he never pointed at her except when she signaled she could bear it. Julian had used his capital like a shield, sending out a statement to the press at 2:15 that framed the trust not as a last-minute maneuver but as a reckoning. "A company should belong to the city it lives in," he wrote, "and tonight mine begins to," and the board's counsel had sent panicked notes and then angry ones and then finally a phone call with a voice like a brittle ornament saying, "You're out," and he had said, "Not yet," and hung up not because he was brave but because there was nothing else to be done. And Mara had felt a strange buoyancy in the air, as though against all math the room had started to rise, and then the door to the back hallway opened and Louise stood there, Julian's long-suffering driver, cheeks flushed from running in the rain, shaking an envelope. "The courier," he said, "is asleep in his car down the block and the traffic cones are a poem, but this is settled," and handed over the stamped and recorded documents like they were a heart he'd rescued, and Julian looked at Mara with the simpler face of a boy and said, "Would you like to do the honors?" And she did, slicing open the triangular belly of the envelope and pulling out the paper with the county seal and the clerk's signature and the raised notary impression like a piece of jewelry, and she laughed then, a real laugh, because when the city wants to be beautiful, it knows how to do it with paper too, and she knew it was not everything, that money was a limber creature and could find its way around obstacles like water, that men like the board members had grown up learning how to puncture anything that looked whole, and yet this was not nothing, and if a city were a person it would have smiled with one corner of its mouth and said, "You absolute maniacs," and offered them a slice of pie in spite of itself. When the sky paled and the rain turned to a fine glitter and the street lights picked their heads up and looked around as though surprised to still be there, the cafe smelled of the way mornings do when you were not expecting a morning, tired and lemon bright, coffee inside the bloodstream, exhaustion slung over the shoulders like an expensive coat one cannot afford and also cannot take off, and Julian stood, every bit of him operating on borrowed electricity, and said, "I have to walk," as though his body required the motion to know it was alive, and she looked at him, at the way his tie hung like a question, and said, "You will cause a small parade," and he half smiled, "I learned from the best," and she felt something unfreeze so slowly she almost didn't notice it. They stepped outside into the clean scrubbed dawn, the door closing behind them with the sound of 2 sides of a life touching, and the street held them with that quiet only a city knows. In the minutes before the bakery truck and the buses and the first dog walker, Mrs. Klein lifted her coffee cup in salute and said, "Don't make me cry before 7, and Maya from the florist tucked the gerberas into a gap in the bench slats and whispered, "For luck," and the high school kids put their phones away in a pantomime of respect that made Mara grin. Julian lifted his face to the light as though for once it was not a spotlight, and she watched him and thought, he is still himself and also someone new, and I can love one without throwing the other into the river. They walked up Cardigan Street with the slow deliberation of those who have nowhere to be except in the next step, and he told her about the first night he had ever seen the Lark and Lantern, how he'd been in a shirt he couldn't afford and a kind of despair he didn't know the price of, how he'd watched her whip egg whites until they held a peak and had thought, there is a skill in this world that my algorithms will never understand, and She told him about the first time she had seen his name in a paper and not called him because she was trying to prove a point to herself, which is to say she was being unkind out of fear, and he told her about the time he had sat alone in a hotel in Tokyo and counted the dots of light on the harbor to keep from calling her at a time that would cheapen what they had left, and she told him about how she had learned to put up drywall and had felt the screws argue with the wood and thought, this is what it is to make a home in a place that resists but not maliciously, and they reached the end of the block and turned around and walked back, and by the time they returned, the day had made itself like a bed and the traffic began, yellow cabs and trucks and a cyclist with a baguette in his bag and a woman in a purple sweatshirt running as though her heart loved the beating. They did not kiss. There are kisses that solve nothing and are only good for the camera, and this was not that story yet. Instead he stood with his hand on the cafe's door as though feeling its pulse and said, I'm resigning at 3, and the sentence hung between them like a bird unsure whether to land, and she nodded as if this had been inevitable. Then you have an empty afternoon, she said, and there's a bent chair in the back that could use the hands of a man who thinks he's good at fixing things, and he smiled, small and real, and said, I make no promises. And she said, for once, and allowed herself the grace of being funny, and he exhaled and then turned to the cluster of microphones that had reassembled like trout and said into them, without heat, good morning, I've made a decision in favor of the block, and as the questions rose like birds startled into flight, she slipped back inside and turned on the lights and the espresso machine hissed like a snake with a gentle temperament, and she began the day the way she began every day, flower on her palms, a song in her throat whether or not anyone could hear it, and if her chest felt roomy and strange and dangerous, well, she had always had a tolerance for risk as long as it smelled of cinnamon. By afternoon, the city had eaten the story and begun metabolizing it, turning it into opinions and hashtags and think pieces and arguments at bars, and on the TV mounted high on the wall in the corner, which she almost never turned on except for soccer and the mayor's press conferences about snow, a panel of faces that always knew everything were explaining to a host who knew nothing what this meant for the market, as if the market were a bird migrating and not a group of people making decisions, and a slideshow of photos ticked past a younger Julian in a sweatshirt with a fundraiser banner behind him, a glossy Julian on a stage with a logo behind him, a recent shot of him standing in the doorway of her cafe as though entering a church, and she snorted and put the volume back to 0 and returned to the business of pulling shots and reading the world's temperature in the tilt of spoons. He called at 3:15 to say, it's done, and the background noise was loud enough that she imagined the boardroom alive with an atmosphere like a thunderstorm under a crystal chandelier, and she said, without preamble, because she had not signed up to soothe or be soothed, good, and then, after a breath, are you okay? And he laughed, ask me in 10 years, and she smiled into the phone, too soon, and he said, I'll come by later and see about the chair, and she said, we close at 10, and he said, I'll bring dinner, and she said, no sushi, and he said, you're heartless, and she said, you've known that, and they hung up, and she stood in the sudden quiet and leaned against the counter and let the moment wash her, the impossible lightness of having acted and the surprising weight of it too. The day went on because days do, with the wrong order and a clogged sink and a woman whose credit card decided to be capricious and a toddler who spilled hot chocolate with all the gravitas of someone tossing a wine glass at a wall in a country house drama. People came in and did not mention the morning, and others came in and couldn't not, and she nodded and thanked and deflected and accepted palm pressing and refused 3 hugs with terms and conditions attached, and she felt, in her body, the way courage and fatigue are neighbors who share a fence and talk to each other across it at dusk, and when night leaned against Cardigan Street again, gentle and a little drunk, he came back with takeout from the Szechuan place and hammer in a bag he'd bought at the hardware store that still smelled like wood and oil, an image that made her laugh so outright that Fig trotted in from the storage room to see what had been so funny, and they ate from cartons at the counter as the last customers drifted off and then pushed up their sleeves and went into the back, the chair wobbly as a newborn baby deer between them, and they argued about whether to replace the leg or shim it, and he advocated for replacement like a man who had learned that sometimes you had to take out foundational things, and she argued for shims because sometimes you had to make do and because she could not afford a new chair, and in the end they did both. They replaced 2 screws and shimmed with a folded business card from a painter who had been promising for 3 years to come in and fix the wall by the restroom, and when they were done, the chair, that humble testament to their politics, held steady. They looked at their work with something that might have become the preamble to other things, and he reached then to touch her shoulder the way a person might touch a book they loved and had returned to the library, and she turned to face him and took his hand and placed it gently, with ceremony, back into the space between them where hands go when they're not being used, and he nodded, no wounds somewhere visible, only a quiet acceptance of the condition that would be required for hope, time. Later, after everything else, after the board filed their first suit and then their second, and Julian, who now had time like a blank page he had to figure out how to fill, showed up in the mornings to chop oranges for marmalade and sometimes left without saying goodbye because he had a sudden memory to wrestle with, and she let him, and when he came back she didn't ask, and when he came back with his sister they sat in the corner and Zoe cried into a napkin without making a sound, and the cat sat on her lap and insisted on existing, and everyone lived and breathed and hurt and healed at human speed. There would be more nights that tasted like clean endings and sharp beginnings, but this night, the first one, the one that had begun with the clink of a lock and a silhouette in rain, would be a night they both carried as if it were made of something breakable and precious, and whenever someone asked them, separately, how a trust had been formed that changed what one block expected of itself, they would give answers that were true and incomplete: the legal reason, the economic reason, the personal reason, and say nothing about the egg yolk that had slid out of its white like a poem, and the way the rain had written in cursive on the glass, and the way the city had leaned in to listen and had then sat back, satisfied, as if to say, look at you two, learning to be better, and leaving the lights on after you leave.